Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I think it's been almost 30 years since I've been to Princeton. So yeah, that's what I was told. So thank you very much for inviting me. This is the best. Well, so the bad scenario is that it turns out I hate elections on the East Coast because you have to stay up. One of the best things about living on the West Coast is that when you wake up, everything's kind of happened already. And elections are largely over by 6 or 7 in the evening. So I'm slightly irritated that I have to actually stay up tonight. But at the same time, I'm obsessed with such things. So this is a wonderful distraction from what is a relatively stressful day for me. So thank you very much again for having me. What I'm going to talk today is I'm actually going to present a fair bit of new stuff. And it's not always the most organized yet, so apologies for that. But I'm going to talk about some of the work that I do in thinking about demographics of the LGBT population, but also the degree to which this work, when you do any work around sexual orientation or gender identity, there's just a given that your work has political and kind of cultural impacts that largely sometimes you can't control and that can be somewhat unpredictable. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. So one of the most fundamental questions is, well, why are we interested in this population at all? Why would we want to count this population? I call myself a demographer now. I've actually never taken a demography course in my life, but it turns out if you get a couple publications in demography, there you go. But I really do, most of my work now focuses on this idea of counting in a population-based sense dimensions of sexual orientation and gender identity. So why is this important? Well, lots and lots of policy debates that, in my opinion, we're better off informing via science than anecdote. So whether it's health disparities, relationship recognition, discrimination, issues of schools and youth and education, all of those I think are better served if we can inform through science. And an example of informing in critical policy debates through anecdote is a famous line in Judge Antonin Scalia's opinion opposing Romer v. Evans, which is a landmark discrimination case that went before the Supreme Court. And he argues basically in a statement around whether LGBT people have political power that basically he argues that gay men are relatively rich and that equates to power. And it's just entirely anecdotal, that information, and it turns out not to be true. But nonetheless, it makes its way into a Supreme Court brief. So the stakes can be fairly high here. A second issue, I argue, is also kind of a political, this one is a more perhaps overt political one, and it's about the visibility of the LGBT community. These questions do raise awareness, and they can challenge stereotypes. Much of what you're going to hear today is data from the Gallup organization, right here in Princeton. They decided in June to add an LGBT question to their daily tracking poll. And I don't think we should underestimate the fact, and they made it a permanent addition. So every night in this country, 1,000 people are being asked whether they're LGBT. And most of them have never, ever been asked that question before. Most people have never been asked that question. So I don't think we should underestimate the ability of that to kind of change the visibility, both having data that people can work with, but also simply that personal interaction where someone has to think about that for the first time. And then finally, why should we ask it? Because we can. And I'm a little bit, cheeky there, but my point is that the pushback for asking these kinds of questions is that it's too complicated, sex is too complicated, people are too, fluid. I hear that a lot. People hang up if this is too sensitive. People aren't going to respond. There's just no evidence that any of that is true. We can ask conceptually clear questions. People are largely willing, they're certainly willing to answer these questions more than they are to answer questions about their income. And we get very concerned about, well, and then everybody's like, well, but did they answer it truthfully? Well, we know for a fact they don't answer the income questions truthfully, and we still use those data. So I do think that it's possible to get good and useful data in this domain. So one of the issues, if we're going to count this population, is we have to think about, well, who are we counting? And so here's two definitions, both of sexual orientation and gender identity, from the American Psychological Association. Sexual orientation is about an enduring pattern of emotional, romantic, sexual attractions. It also refers to a person's sense of identity based on these attractions and related behaviors. And it's also membership in a community of others who share those attractions. If there's any survey methodologists in the room, wow, that's a nightmare of measurement. There's an awful lot of constructs there that we could measure. We crudely divide this into three broad ideas. The notion of identity, what labels do you use? The notion of behavior, I would add to the issue of behavior, and you'll see more in my talk. We need to think about both the timing and the extent of the behavior when we think about grouping as a demographic. And then, in attraction, the definition includes emotional, romantic, and sexual. You could argue that all three of those are completely conceptually different. You can be emotionally attracted to someone that you're not sexually attracted to. You can be romantically attracted to someone who you may not be emotionally attracted to. So those are all potentially different. But again, because they're different doesn't necessarily mean we can't measure it. It just means we need to be clear about what we're measuring and who we measure. And then for gender identity, it's transgender, the term, is an umbrella term for a person whose gender identity, expression, or behavior does not conform to that typically associated with the sex they were assigned at birth. Refers to a person's internal sense of being male, female, or something else. Gender expression refers to the way a person communicates gender through behavior, clothing, hairstyles, etc. So again, a similar kind of, or at least analogous grouping of how we might think about this. First, you have the terms that people use to describe their gender identity: transgender, transsexual, maybe queer. To be honest, I should put in there male or female, because those are terms people use to describe their gender identity, regardless of how they got to that. A second is there's a behavioral component, whether it's medical intervention, surgical, or taking hormones or other kinds of medical treatments, issues of appearance, how you dress. And again, I would also argue the timing and the extent of those things have a play in thinking about who we include in this group. And then finally, analogous to kind of the attraction, which is this internal sense of sexual attraction, we obviously have an internal sense of our gender that may not necessarily be the same as our behaviors or our terminology for ourselves. And in an ideal world, like with sexual orientation, those circles would be identity here, then behavior, then attraction. Unfortunately, and similar with gender, we might do the identity here, the behaviors here, and the notion of an internal sense out here. Unfortunately, we don't have concentric circles. They look more like this when we ask these questions. And so that can be really complicated. Again, complicated to me in terms of defining who you're studying, not so much complicated in terms of being able to ask these kinds of questions. So what happens when you ask the questions? So I did a short little research brief about a year and a half ago in which I looked at about internationally almost a dozen population-based surveys. There were 6 of them that were US-based. To me, all of them had potential biases in terms of methodologies that could bias estimates up and down in the way the questions were asked and what was asked. I decided, just in the most crude way, decided let's average over these surveys and get a sense of what they say about identity, behavior, and attraction. One pretty serious caveat, the transgender, I was interested in population-based surveys. I could only find 2. They are only state level, so one was Massachusetts, one was California. That is not a very robust estimate under any guise. But I felt it was important to use that term and to at least study those 2 surveys to make the point that A, we don't have a lot of data, and B, that as a part of the LGBT political and cultural world, it's important that we always remember the gender identity component. But what I found was an estimate of a little shy of 4%. In terms of sexual orientation, roughly half LG versus B. If we looked at any same-sex behavior since age 18, the average was a little over 8%. And then if I looked at attraction, so anything but exclusively attracted to different sex partners, you get an average of about 11%. I'm going to talk in a moment about the reaction to that. This is the political side of the talk. But let me just say that when you put out numbers like this, people do react, and they react very strongly. And most of people ask me, you've done all this work around LGBT, does the conservative movement, the religious right, political movement, do they attack you all the time? And my short answer is no. Almost all of the people who attack me are LGBT people. Because they don't like these numbers at all, and I'll show you in a minute. But my kind of minor I told you so moment was when Gallup asked a question on their tracking poll. So they interviewed 121,000 people over the course of 4 months, June through September, and they got a number remarkably similar to my little estimate. So I do think, at least for identity, we're in the ballpark there. So what do people say? Well, Larry Kramer famously said, "I'm a horse's ass," and God save us from statisticians who, along with epidemiologists, are the enemy. The only consolation I can give Larry is that technically I'm neither a statistician nor an epidemiologist, so you're kind of safe from me. So there are kind of 3 crude areas that I would lump responses when you put out these numbers. A, this issue of the closet and people's reaction to you can't measure it because there's so many people who won't tell you things. B, people don't know what to do with, there's a lot of biphobia, for lack of a better word. People don't know what to do with bisexuals, and they get very nervous about it. And C, there's an awful lot of fairly ugly transphobia that happens when you include gender identity measures. So my friend Peter Sprigg from the Family Research Council focused on the bisexual number, saying it's a problem for the gay political movement. It undermines the idea that being born homosexual is immutable. And his idea is that if bisexuals say they're interested in sexual relationships with both same-sex and different sex, that tells you that people can choose to be gay. So if you choose the same sex, you've chosen to be gay. And since half of the LGB is bisexual, he's arguing that the majority of gay people can, in fact, just choose to be gay. It's a rather convoluted logic, but it has its own internal logic, I guess. Here's an example of transphobia. A commenter on a very popular LGBT blog. I identify as a gay man, not some stupid acronym. Plus, the last thing I would want is to be lumped into the same group as trannies. The Associated Press, in reporting that study that talked about identity, behavior, and attraction, and L versus G versus B versus T, decided that the one important finding was that 4 million adults, 1.7 of population, are lesbian and gay. So bisexuals didn't matter. Transgender doesn't matter. That was the important finding, which was, I thought, fascinating. And this was a reporter who supposedly does LGBT work. And then a rather prominent activist wrote me an email saying, unlike racial, ethnic, or religious categories, there are many people who objectively should fall into the LGBT umbrella who reject any such identification. I'm not sure how one would objectively decide that, but nonetheless, again, this kind of allusion to the challenge of the closet. And all of these things kind of pervade how we think about this and how I think about it through the lens of demography. So one of the things I thought was, well, is there a way to measure the closet and to think about the closet? So one way is to just go back to this and say, well, you have this number here, So everybody who's above that number on these charts is in the closet. I'm not sure I fully agree with that. So I looked at 3 different ways, and this is where the timing and extent thing are salient. So one is I looked at behavior since age 18 and then sexual behavior in the last 5 years and compared it to LGBT identity. And this is from 2 surveys, the National Health and Social Life Survey and the General Social Survey, both conducted by NORC. Both essentially have the exact same questions, but over the course of, one was conducted in 92, the other were conducted in 2008 and 2010, so a roughly 2-decade difference. And then I did a cohort thing. So I took the same, not the same group of people, but this group of people in that age bracket 20 years later. And so what you find is that in that time, what has changed in terms of overall same-sex behavior since age 18 is that the people who answered an LGBT identity has ticked up a little bit, but what has exploded are these people who say they've had some same-sex experience ever. What I, now refer to as the little bit gay group. If this is your closet, it means that the closet has exploded in the last 20 years. So what that implies, if this is your definition, and let me be clear, I'm not making an argument for what I think is the right or the wrong definition. What I'm making the argument is that if you decide this is your definition, what you're implying is that the closet is getting enormously bigger every day because of that definition. And that kind of counters this notion that as society becomes more accepting, that people are becoming less closeted. People are coming out earlier in life, all of those memes that we hear. So I think that's one definition. If, however, we think more about timing and extent of behavior, we get much more modest changes over time. So behavior in the last 5 years, again, slight uptick in identity, but the closet in this case has mildly shrunk. So proportionally fewer people don't identify as LGBT but have had same-sex behaviors in the last 5 years or last year. And this looks a lot more, and so it suggests a slightly shrinking closet. But perhaps even more importantly, from a demographer, is that those groups just aren't the same people demographically. So people who have had either have LGBT identity or say they've had same-sex behaviors in the last 5 years are less likely to have had a child. They're less likely to be seniors. They have higher education. They're much more likely to have never been married. I think this is women, yeah. And they're more politically liberal. If we add the little bit gay group into that, they look like heterosexuals. They don't look that different from and maybe that's fine, but it's just understand that demographically it's true, and those patterns are dramatic differences in child rearing for men. But again, note that these two groups look very demographically similar, and then the outlier group demographically is the ever having had same-sex sex. So what I would just argue about that is that, again, the definition matters, and we need to think more critically about who we're including. And I think a simple definition that anybody who's ever had same-sex sex, and by the way, this all works for attraction as well. So there's a boom in people who say they're mostly attracted to different sex. And it's had that same explosive behavior and get the exact same patterns. So there's clearly something changing. So how about measuring bisexuality? Again, it's this definitional problem. If you go down the Peter Sprigg world and think that bisexuality is about this, like who you actually, behavioral definition of who you have sex with, if we look at same-sex sex partners since 18, the vast majority of the LGBT group is bisexual because most people have had sex with both same-sex, almost 87%. But and I think this is important in this slide, the ratio of bi to gay in identity is roughly 50-50. If we look at sex over the sex of your sex partners over the last 5 years, it's also roughly 50-50. It has a very similar proportion. So behavior in the last 5 years comports, remember it comported demographically, it also comports in this gay-bi distinction much more closely. In the last year, you get more same-sex behavior, but that makes sense too. It's this notion that bisexuals are just utterly indifferent and just flip back and forth all the time. That's probably not the case. They have, relatively stable relationships. And so over 5 years, you pick that up. Over 1 year, you only pick up, one dimension of the relationships. So again, I think it's not necessarily that there's a right or wrong answer, but understand the implications of the definition. And I would argue that there's a fairly strong evidence that sexual behavior in the last 5 years comports quite closely to identity. And so in my definition of the closet, which is probably the closet has some dimension of the discordance being in some ways destructive or problematic, that to me is my idea of the closet, that this group and this group are the two that you kind of, because it's not clear to me that all these people struggle every day with the fact that 10 years ago they had a same-sex incident or sexual encounter and that it's haunted them for their entire lives. That just doesn't completely comport either with what people tell you, or I'm not even sure that it makes that much sense. So, so bisexuality. So I'm going to flip now. Was that a question? Yeah. Yeah.
In terms of the closet, do you also consider the people who might not respond to this identity? Like a lot of your issues about the closet have been comparing people.
Right.
Different.
Right. And yeah, and then there are definitely people who. Now, what's curious is, it turns out that in surveys where you ask people their identity and you ask who they've told about their identity, there's a small but non-trivial group who will tell a survey person but actually say they've never told anyone else. So it's not an exclusively non-closeted group. But yeah, I do think that is that we have to remember is that there might be folks who just don't want to answer that question in any fashion. Yeah.
Have you tried the different kinds of like randomized response techniques?
Yeah, I haven't tried. Usually the data, your sample sizes limit you quite a bit in that regard. But I'm going to talk about some of the Gallup data that actually we could start to look at some of that. So one of the challenges in the political discourse is that if you base your notion of who is LGBT by largely watching network television, which if you're someone like me, that's entirely possible given the amount of network television that I watch, you would believe that all LGBT people are white, male, urban, and rich, and largely lawyers. And it turns out, shockingly, they're not. So in the general social survey, which is it's a sample over the 2 years, it's about a 4,000 person sample, so a little over 100 LGBT respondents. You get a bigger non-white group than the, and that the difference of non-white versus white is actually significant in that group. And then when we did the Gallup survey, again, very similar, interestingly, to the GSS, a little more heavily Latino, but again, more non-white. And the National Trans Discrimination Survey is not a population-based survey, but it is a huge survey of trans people in the U.S., tens of thousands, I think, respondents. And again, it was a big chunk of them were non-white. So this is not an exclusively white phenomenon. When we look at the demographics from the Gallup survey, you find higher percentages of LGBT identification. So the Gallup question is, do you personally identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? So it's entirely an identity question. That's the only thing being measured here. And the notion was that we wanted the sense of a political, cultural identity with this politically and culturally known and group. So you get higher proportions in non-white populations. So what is that about? Well, one of the things I think that I'm interested in flipping around is I have historically thought a lot about what are the demographics of the LGBT population, but you could also flip it and say, how do population-based demographics affect who identifies as LGBT? And it turns out, for race and ethnicity in the United States, the age and sex distribution of non-white people in the U.S. is very different than the white population. It's much more it's younger and it's more female. Who self-identifies more as LGBT? Younger people and females. So if I take the non-white total is 4.1%. The white total was 3.2. If I give this group the exact same age and sex distribution as the non-white population in the U.S., it goes down to 3.4%. Arguably, it's explaining almost all of the difference. Is explained by the underlying demographics of the non-white population. So I think that's very important for us to remember. So what that really is starting to tell us is that LGBT identity may not differ all that much across those groups, at least from a racial ethnic standpoint. So one thing that is very obvious is that it differs a lot across age cohorts. And this may, in fact, be some evidence of the closet. These older people have experienced social stigma in ways that are very, very different than younger people and may be much more reluctant to self-identify. In fact, there seems to be a big shift with 30 and under. So in Gallup, it was 6.4% to just 2%. So younger people were 3 times more likely to identify. But it turns out that there's a pretty big difference between, of all things, white men and everybody else. So white men, the gap is only about a 1.6. The odds ratio is only about 1.6. For white women, they're almost 6 times more likely than older. With younger women are almost 6 times more likely. For non-white men, it's double, and for white women, 4. So again, non-white men and a whole lot of women explaining this age difference. And I'm not sure that I have all the answers as to why, but I think this research starts to at least pose some of those questions for us to think about that. One of the most intriguing findings from Gallup is that you saw lower educational attainment in the LGBT sample. There's almost never been a survey that's shown that. It's almost always higher educational attainment. It certainly is in same-sex couples, and in the General Social Survey it's higher. It is higher for same-sex couples, and it was quite high in the trans survey. So one of the things I thought about that is, well, maybe that's an artifact of age. And it turns out it's not. It was lower in every age grouping, at least the percent with a college degree. That probability was lower in the LGBT sample. So it's not, or it's about the same for the older. But it's not it's a little bit of an artifact of age, but not all of it, I don't think, is just age. So I want to do more work on that and thinking about race and ethnicity and other kinds of distributional things. But it is a kind of provocative finding. We've always assumed that either LGBT people select into higher education as a kind of hedge against discrimination, or they see educational environments as kind of being more supportive, or in fact, colleges make people gay because they are more supportive and people come out more, whatever. So whether it's a treatment or selection argument, that's been kind of the arguments around. This kind of turns that on its head a little bit. If anything, it suggests if it turns out there's not necessarily these disparities, it doesn't look like the differences are as big as we've traditionally thought in this regard. You also, so all the rich white gay men, you don't see that in the Gallup data. So this is a little tricky because I only have household income. So I looked at 2 groups. Employed people where there was only 1 adult in the household. So hopefully the household income is largely their income. And you see that for women, and so the economics literature, the little bit there is on this, says that lesbians earn similar or more than non-lesbians and gay men earn less than other men, is the normative kind of economics argument. Here, it suggests that these single women, LGBT women, definitely do not earn more. They have they're much lower at the top end of the scale, and fairly similar. At best, you'd argue that there's not big differences, and there's almost no differences for gay men. The only statistically significant was that the LGBT women were less likely to be in the really high income bracket, and this is monthly income. And then I took another group, which is people who said they were married or partnered and there were only 2 adults in the household. So hopefully the household income is reflecting the shared income of the 2 people. And again, LGBT and not, so you would expect not big differences between men and women, non-LGBT. There's not dramatic differences. And then you do see, again, basically just no differences. So it's not necessarily that people make more or less, but there's clearly no evidence of some kind of excessive wealth. What about child rearing? It turns out that lots and lots of LGBT people, a fairly large amount, have children, not quite as high as non-LGBT, but particularly for women, more than you might think. And secondly, that it turns out that racial ethnic minorities, similar to, but even to a greater difference, are way more likely to have kids among LGBT people than white people. So you see 38% of white women. I decided to limit it to under age 50 because it's child in the home, and it felt like the age distribution is so different so non-LGBT people have a lot more older people who are less likely to have a kid in the home. So I thought just for these kind of crosstab purposes. All of this could, in theory, eventually be tested in multivariate methods. The Gallup survey actually, finally, there's enough sample to do that, and I hope to do that. But in the crosstab, like I said, you see higher rates for non-whites, but all lower. What's interesting for African American women, really not incredible disparities based on LGBT status. For men, way fewer white and African American men saying they have kids in the home, but really high for Hispanic and Asian men. And again, I'm not sure. The one intriguing finding that we've seen in same-sex couples, if there's a Latina or an African American in the couple, you see high rates. Asian hasn't always been that predictive as in these data. I don't know whether that's real, whether that could be some quirky measurement error. But it's certainly worth looking at. No. We don't know anything about the partner. We actually don't even know the sex of the partner. So some of these could be people in different sex relationships, if they're bisexually identified or even gay, lesbian identified, but particularly among the bisexuals. So I mean, the one good news is that these tend to be a little higher than we see in the same-sex couples, which you would expect, given that there's bisexuals in this mix, and you would think that same-sex couples are more disproportionately lesbian gay. But no, unfortunately we don't. We do, in the same-sex couples in the census, see higher interracial relationships in same-sex than in different sex. So here's the curious thing about child rearing in certainly LGBT. I don't know a lot about the T side, but if when you hear gay people raising kids, you think of adoption and surrogacy and sperm, then you should get that out of your head. That's not the normative way that LGBT people, certainly not LGBT people, have kids. Most of them have kids at a younger age. So age when you were first born in the general social survey is younger in LGBT men, and this is significantly different. It's younger in men. It's a little bit different in women. In the California Health Interview Survey, the percent who had their first child before age 20 is dramatically higher for LGBT women than for heterosexually identified women. So LGBT people, if they have kids, they have them young. They also, there's a really big difference in educational attainment. So in both the American Community Survey and in the Gallup survey, people with less than a high school are about as likely as LGBT people or same-sex couples are as likely to have children in the home at really low levels of education as the rest of the population. The rest of the population, it doesn't vary much by education, but in the LGBT population, it goes dramatically down, the probability of having a kid. It goes down with education. So as a result of those two findings, you see pretty big income disparities if you look at households with kids. So more than half of these single adult households, LGBT single adult households with kids, make less than $24,000 a year in the Gallup survey. That's a little bit driven because it's disproportionately female, but it's still really low. If you look at two adult households, again, skewed much more towards this low income than the non-LGBT population. And perhaps the most counterintuitive finding is parenting in the LGBT community is going down, despite Modern Family. And the reason it's going down is that there's no question that adoption and reproductive technology is going up. In the census, the number of same-sex couples with an adopted child has tripled over the last 10 years. That is rising. I don't debate that. But the way most LGBT people have their kids is when they're young, probably before they're out. And that is declining because people, in fact, are coming out earlier, which means they're less likely to have different sex relationships, and they're less likely to produce kids. By the way, there's multiple studies that show that adolescents with same-sex sexual attractions are more likely than adolescents with exclusively different sex attractions to either have a child or say that they've impregnated a girlfriend. So this story comports with other data. But as a result of that, there's two effects happening. Lots more adoption and reproductive technology and lots less early sex with different sex partners. And so the overall percent having kids is declining, which yet another reason the LGBT movement doesn't always love me. Because politically, that's a problematic number for the movement. And talking about LGBT people who have kids young with different sex partners is also really tricky to think about. So these things have these kind of political implications. Not surprisingly, LGBT people are more likely to be single. When we look at the Gallup data, a bigger group of non-LGBT say they're married, or so LGBT people, not surprisingly, say partnered more, given the legal climate. That's not surprising. Obviously, some of these might be different sex marriages. We don't know the sex of the partner. But what comports here is slightly higher rates of coupling for LGBT women than men. We've seen that in other data. And again, larger fractions who are single. If you look at exclusively L and G, so if you take the B out of the equation, the prevailing evidence is that lesbian identified women are about as likely as heterosexually identified women to say they're in a cohabiting relationship. And gay men are less likely. However, gay male relationships in almost every survey ever done have longer duration than lesbian relationships. So, there are these different dynamics, and I won't go down any really nasty stereotypes in that regard. But it's definitely, it's been shown in a lot of data sources, those two patterns. So, pivoting then to the coupled people, a couple slides just from the census. The 2010 census was the first in which the federal government told us how many same-sex couples designated one person as a husband and wife. In the past, those were all just reported as unmarried partners. They always collected it the same way, but they reported them as unmarried partners. Today, 2010, they told us how many used husband and wife. It turned out to be 20%. You should not assume that 20% of same-sex couples are legally married. We found in a survey of same-sex couples after the census that about 7 in 10 said they were legally married, and only about half were both legally married and lived in a state that recognized their marriage. And also, 4% of the unmarried partners said they were legally married, and they make up the bulk, so that's not a small group. They chose unmarried partner because they said they thought that was the right answer. because their state or the federal government didn't recognize, so they used unmarried partner. All by way of saying this is complicated in same-sex context. About 5.5 out of 1,000, much bigger portion of unmarried partners. Gay people are everywhere. Roughly half and half, although a little majority female, which is consistent with the sexual orientation thing. And no surprise, the high concentrated states were, the New England, the West Coast, D.C., Delaware snuck in there. Thanks, go Rehoboth. And kind of West and New England and West and mountain states. This is the map of the U.S., higher concentrations, darker blue. Again, not surprising, the coasts in New England, southern Florida. To be honest, everyone asks about what's going on in upper Wisconsin and Alaska. I actually... a really, really gay place. I actually think, and I can't, unfortunately, it would take a lot of work to do this. I think... and we don't have the microdata yet from the census. I think some of this is measurement error. The problem here is these are places where there are really disproportionately large households with lots of people. So I'm dad. My daughter is living with her boyfriend in the house. I call him an unmarried partner thinking that I'm supposed to say how he's related to her, and then it looks like, and if there's not many same-sex couples to start with, and there's a few households where they make that mistake, you suddenly get northern Wisconsin. So I think that's what's happening. I can't prove it. So I just want to quickly look at the difference in these maps. The next map is where same-sex couples are the most likely to have kids. It's like the opposite mirror image map. It's the South and Midwest. So my little cheeky phrase to that is, religious conservatives are responsible for the bulk of LGBT families right now in the United States. Places with higher levels of social stigma definitely have proportionally more same-sex couples, at least, raising kids. And then my last couple slides, so I can leave some time for questions. It is election day. We collected political information in the Gallup data. I don't think it's surprising that LGBT people say they're more liberal. What certainly surprised some LGBT people is that the majority are not liberal. The majority called themselves moderate or conservative. And the majority are not actually Democrats. The majority say they're independent. In fact, independence, you're as likely to be an independent as a Democrat among the LGBT population. The non-LGBT is a little more likely to be independent than to have either a party affiliation, and about 13% Republican. So when we look at presidential preferences, this was the most fun fact that I found. In really close elections, this little small group, turns out, could maybe make a difference. So here's LGBT vote nationally. So just to be clear, this was registered voters over a 4-month period. So this is not a point-in-time estimate of voting. But it shows that over that time period, it was basically 3-to-1 Obama to Romney. That has been the number of the LGBT vote since as far back as Clinton. Largely, it's 3-to-1 Democrat to Republican. So that's fairly consistent. However, if you look at the non-LGBT in that group, Romney was ahead. When you throw in the LGBT vote, Obama goes ahead. If you are as obsessed with political prognostication as I am, I go to Nate Silver about 7 times a day, it feels like, in the last week. He rates the most. The closest state right now is Florida. He gives it a virtual 50-50 probability. Gallup would yell at me. The state data are not necessarily representative at a 4-month sample. They actually like to extend it out more to 6 months. But you see the same roughly national gap for Obama and Romney. But in Florida, the non-LGBT vote has Romney ahead. And if you throw in the LGBT, Obama goes ahead. So this is more kind of like just a little political fun fact more than anything. But I do think that it does say that in very close elections, even these small populations, a little bit of lean, heavier or less, one way or another, can actually have an impact. So I will stop there and take some questions.